All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third Zoom session for 660. Hope you're all doing well and your week's off to a good start. Thank you for your beach board postings comparing public and private organization, the similarities and differences between those two different sectors. I reviewed all those and I have provided grades and then some feedback on each one of those, so those should already be all finished up for you. Then your next beach board assignment coming up for this week is to look at some of the information we covered last week when we looked at classical organization theorists, and think about your organization and two ways in which your organization represents some of Max Weber's approaches, and two ways in which your organization reflects Frederick Taylor and scientific management. And so that will be your next beach board essay due. Again, it's good if you can get your initial post done earlier in the week and then wrap up your responses to classmates no later than midnight on Sunday. So that's where we are. I think we're in good shape keeping up with those beach board essays. This week, just like the previous week, I think all the essays were good. I didn't provide a whole lot of feedback, but I did provide some feedback in terms of some of the more important differences or similarities that you mentioned in your post, and just elaborating upon those a little bit more. Because one of the things that we do see is we do see a lot of differences in how things are done, not necessarily what's done, but how it's done. And one of the commonalities I saw across most of the essays had to do with funding and the source of funding. And we saw that in the public sector, public organizations are oftentimes far more reliant upon appropriations and more stable sources of revenue than their private sector counterparts. And that reliance upon stable sources of revenue can really have some profound implications for the behavior of that organization. And some authors, again, there's not an overwhelming consensus on this, but some authors in public administration will make the argument that since public organizations are reliant upon stable sources of revenue like appropriations, they tend to be less innovative and less creative and somewhat less motivated by the value of efficiency than perhaps their private sector counterparts, since they know that revenue is most likely going to come year after year, and oftentimes with small augmentations in a marginal incremental fashion, with maybe 2 or 3% increases from one year to the next. Now, again, there's not an overwhelming consensus on that, but some authors have found a little bit less risk-taking and a little bit less focus on efficiency on the part of public organizations. Some other folks talked about the functions and some similarities in the functions between their public organization and a private sector organization. I also saw some discussion of the organizational structure as being similar, that we kind of see this adherence to a Max Weber classical type of organization structure, not only in public sector organizations, but in private sector organizations as well. So again, a lot of commonalities between the posts, which is very common, no pun intended, and that's the way in which it should work. So far so good on all those beach board essays. So last week we dealt with the classical school of organization theory, and we showed some of the threads that tie those classical theorists together. We also talked about some of the things that differentiate them. And so we know in the classical school, one of the things that really ties all those theories together is a macro level focus, a focus on the organization and organizational effectiveness, and not so much a focus on individual employees and their wants, needs, and desires. We also know that a thread that really ties those classical theorists together has to do with their attempt to find that panacea, that one-size-fits-all approach to their theories. We then also said that there are some differences between people like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor. And we said some of those differences revolved around things such as the structural focus of Max Weber versus the process-oriented focus of a Frederick Taylor. And we then moved on and talked about the principal school with people like Gulick and Fail and Mooney, and how they really focused on the principles, that if we can teach our managers these principles and provide them with this managerial toolkit, then our managers can take that toolkit, go out in the world, and be effective and efficient in managing their organizations. And so some similarities and some differences in our classical theorists. But regardless of which classical theorist we looked at, whether it was Weber or Taylor or Gulick or Mooney or Fayol, one of the primary criticisms lodged against the classical school of organization theory is that they overlook individual employees. And they really don't focus much of their attention on the wants, needs, and desires of those individual employees. Employees, for most classical theorists, are cogs in the machinery. And if a cog gets broken, we replace it with a new cog. Because of those criticisms, we started to see, first off with Mary Parker Follett and later with people like Elton Mayo, a new school of organization theory develop. And this, what we call neoclassical school, is what's known as the human relations theory. And human relations theory really starts to place a value upon individual employees and realize that the work of the organization can only be done because of the work of individual employees. And if we didn't have those employees, if we don't have satisfied employees, then they will not be motivated to put forth an effort to help us accomplish organizational goals. So the human relations approach, the human relations school, this type of what we call neoclassical type of theory, really is written as a rejoinder and a response to those criticisms that were lodged against the classical school. Now, Tompkins likes to talk about this first author we'll talk about tonight, Mary Parker Follett, as being a pre-human relations theorist. And I think from a chronological perspective, I think Tompkins is certainly correct. When you look at when Mary Parker Follett was doing her writing, she was writing primarily in the 1920s and at the very height of scientific management. So when all these organizations were buying into Frederick Taylor and scientific management, and all these organizations were adopting scientific management as their process, you had one lone voice in the wilderness, which was Mary Parker Follett, who stood up and really took issue with scientific management, primarily taking issue with the way in which it devalued individual employees and the way in which it did not really favor much participation between members of an organization. So chronologically, I think that Tompkins is right, is that Mary Parker Follett was writing before the actual advent of the human relations school. However, a lot of the theories that she developed and approaches that she developed are approaches that would later be parroted by human relations theorists. Now, human relations theorists like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger, they really didn't have much idea about Mary Parker Follett. They really didn't know her writing. They really didn't read her writing, because unfortunately for Follett, she was a female writing about organizational issues in the 1920s and the 1930s. So she really didn't get a lot of the acclaim that she really deserved until later on in our more modern perspectives on organization theory. But a lot of what she was writing about in the 1920s and 1930s, very similar to what her male counterparts were writing about a decade or 2 decades later. So I understand chronologically why Tompkins includes her as a pre-human relations theorist. For our purposes in this class, we're going to deal with her within the School of Human Relations, realizing that she actually was a pioneer and kind of wrote before the Human Relations School was even a thing. But because a lot of her theories are so similar to the theories of human relations theorists, I think it makes sense to kind of group her in with Human Relations School. Mary Parker Follett is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, organization theorists. And I hope you've run into her before in the program, especially in your 500 course. But one of the things I like the most about Mary Parker Follett is that she was kind of that lone voice out there in the wilderness who was willing to counter a lot of these prevailing theories before it was accepted to counter these theories. And the way in which Mary Parker Follett really approached her work is she liked to view running an organization kind of as a democracy. And she said, this is where the major flaws are in scientific management. Democracies are predicated upon participation. As we know in social contract theory and our system of American government, power, at least in theory, derives from the people. And in a true social contract type of democracy, people decide what power to give to government so that government can use that power in a judicious manner to then provide for the welfare of the public. So it's kind of that relationship where power and resources should be coming from the people. Clearly, in scientific management, that was not happening. Scientific management was a very top-down type of an approach. We come up with the one best way to do the job by micromanaging our employees. We teach them how to do that job in the one best way. We then monitor their performance. If they're performing well, we give them rewards. If they're not performing well, then we penalize them or we remove them from the organization. So kind of scientific management is kind of the antithesis of what Follett viewed as what she called a democratic organization. So she hoped with her theories that she could remedy some of those types of flaws with scientific management. So again, Follett viewed an organization and running an organization very similar to running a democracy. And so she talked a lot about democratic organizations. So she basically told us in order to understand a democratic organization, we have to understand a democracy. And we have to understand how democracies work, where power comes from in a democracy, as well as some of the fundamental flaws that are inherent in representative democracies like we have here in the US. And according to Follett, there are two fundamental flaws associated with representative democracies. One fundamental flaw is what she refers to as particularized interests. And if you are a fan of some of the writings of the founders of the country and people like James Madison and Federalist Papers, you know that James Madison talked a lot about these particularized interests. Madison referred to them as factions. And hopefully in your 500 class, you got exposed to some of these Federalist Papers if you hadn't been exposed to them earlier on in your undergraduate years. But one Federalist paper that really is probably, if not the most famous, one of the most famous Federalist Papers is Federalist Paper number 10. And in Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison warns us about the negative impacts of factions in our new democracy. And the argument that Madison makes in Federalist number 10 is that factions are going to be part of a democracy. And there are two ways that you can deal with factions. And again, what Madison meant by factions, very similar to what Follett's referring to as particularized interests. So groups of people who have similar ideas and who have similar wants, needs, and desires, who will then mobilize to try and get their ends accomplished, and they're trying to accomplish what they want to accomplish. According to Madison and Federalist 10, to deal with those factions, there are two ways to do it. One way to deal with factions is we can eliminate factions, just outlaw them, make them illegal, and they go away. The problem with that, according to Madison, is if you eliminate factions, you are also eliminating democracy, because you cannot eliminate factions and still call yourself a true democracy. There are a lot of nations around the world that call themselves democracies, and a lot of nations that actually have the word democratic right there in their name. The problem is that even though a nation calls itself democratic or a democratic republic, does not make it a democracy. A lot of countries that call themselves democracies quash objections, and they quash opposition, and they quash these factions and do not allow these factions to exist. Well, if you do that, you're bridging freedom of speech, which is an elemental aspect of any type of democratic system of government. So Madison says we're going to throw that one out. We cannot eliminate factions. Factions are a natural part of a democracy. Follett tells us these factions, these particularized interests, are also a natural part of a democratic organization. So we're going to have those factions. The second flaw of a democracy is passivity among citizens. That democracies will oftentimes create passive citizens, where it will give all these different avenues for participation, but citizens won't take advantage of those avenues. They tend to take the path of least resistance. And in democracy, the path of least resistance is oftentimes voting. Well, voting is a relatively passive type of endeavor. You can vote from home. You can vote using an absentee ballot, so you don't even have to go to the polls anymore. Here in California, everybody gets an absentee ballot, so you don't have to apply for it. You'll get an absentee ballot, fill it out, send it in, and you have voted. Not that that's a bad thing. There's nothing but not speak of that in a pejorative way, but it does mean it's a relatively passive way to participate. And that's how most people participate in democracies. But there are a lot of other avenues for participation. Other than voting, you could contribute money to a candidate or to a political party or to a cause. You could volunteer for a campaign, whether it be for a candidate or for a cause, and volunteer your time. You can run for office if you are so inclined. You can attend city council meetings. You can write letters to your representatives, because we are a democratic republic, so we elect people to represent us. You can engage in discourse about politics. You can talk to people and have debates and discussion about politics and policy. So there are a lot of avenues, but most of them require a lot more effort than just voting. So people tend to vote, and it tends to make very passive types of citizens. Well, it's the same type of thing in organizations. Employees tend to be relatively passive in organizations as well. So Follett geared a lot of her theories to trying to address these two fundamental flaws of a representative democracy and democratic organizations. How do we deal with factions, these particularized interests, and how do we deal with passivity on the part of our citizens/employees? Well, first off, Follett tells us that, just like Madison told us, factions are a natural outgrowth of a democracy. So these particularized interests, these particularized groups are going to occur in a democracy. They're going to occur in a democratic organization. If you accept that you're going to have these particularized interests, then you also have to accept conflict, because one group's interests will differ from another group's interests. So these groups are going to come into conflict with each other. So conflicts are going to happen in organizations, especially a democratic organization like what Follett has envisioned. So she says there are three ways in which we can deal with conflict. One way we deal with conflict is through domination. One wins, one loses. So Group A has more resources and more power. Group A wins, Group B loses. Follett says that is the single worst way to deal with conflict, because that party that loses, that group that loses, obviously is going to be disaffected. They are not going to buy into what's going on in the organization. They are going to oppose the implementation of what Group A wants to do. We know from the world of policy implementation literature that the best way in order to implement a policy is to get the acceptance on the part of our implementers. And if our implementers oppose the policy, and especially if they strongly oppose the policy, they're going to create a lot of barriers to stop the implementation of that policy. So domination's not good, because you'll have one disaffected group, at least one disaffected group. The losers will not be happy. A better way, but still not the best way, is negotiation and compromise. And that's your second way of dealing with conflict. Well, it's better than domination, but it's still not the most appropriate way. It's not the most appropriate way because in negotiation and compromise, both parties give something up in order to come to an agreement. Well, since Group A and Group B are both giving something up, Group A and Group B will never be fully satisfied. They're always going to be disappointed because they had to give something up to come to this negotiated compromise. So yes, we get a compromise, but probably no one is happy with that compromise. The most appropriate way, I'll try not to say best, but the most appropriate way, according to Follett, is through a process known as integration and interpenetration of ideas. Integration, interpenetration of ideas means that we participate in the organization, we communicate openly, we share ideas, we share perspectives, and through this process of sharing perspectives, you have this interpenetration going on. The interpenetration of ideas is where one group's ideas will interpenetrate into another group and vice versa. Through that interpenetration of ideas, you can then integrate into a new way of addressing the problem. So rather than just one party winning out, or rather than compromising, you can take all these different ideas and synthesize them into something new. And that something new, that new solution, is then something that everyone can get on board with because you have shared these ideas between everyone and all the groups within your organization. It's what a very famous political scientist by the name of Theodore Loy referred to as the marketplace of ideas. He likes to refer to our system of democracy as being a marketplace of ideas. Just like a marketplace, you go there to make transactions, and in this marketplace of ideas, you go there to transact in ideas. And so you find out other people's ideas, you share your ideas with them, and that's this interpenetration of ideas that then provides us with this third way of resolving conflict with it, which is integration. However, in order to be able to properly engage in integration as a way to resolve conflict, everyone who is involved must have resources. They must have power within the organization. If you have wildly different power resources between parties, chances are you're probably going to be looking a lot more like domination than integration. And this is another way where Follett really parts company with the classical theorists. In the classical theories, power was something that was exercised in what's called a power over type of way. So with Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and all the other classical theorists, it was upper level management and leaders who were exercising power over their subordinates. So it's a power over type of relationship. Follett says it can't be like that. Instead, it needs to be what you refer to as a power with relationship. And in the power with relationship, Follett would argue that power is not a resource that you give to a subordinate, but rather it's a resource that needs to be developed. And again, I think last week we alluded to this idea of power, especially in the world of political science. And there are many different definitions of power. I think one definition that is kind of pretty well agreed upon in the field is the idea that power is the ability to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. That's a pretty basic definition of power. But power is not something, according to Follett, that you can give to your subordinates. It's something you have to help your subordinates develop so they can develop their own power base. And by developing their own power resources, they then have the tools that they need to engage in this interpenetration and integration process. Absent that, they will not have the resources they need to properly engage in that type of a relationship. So that's a really important distinction between Follett and the classical theorists, how we use power. I don't want to digress too much in terms of this idea of the word power. In a future class, when we all get together again in intergovernmental relations, which I think is scheduled for the fall of 2022, we will have a protracted discussion of power and what power is. And I will introduce you to one of my favorite theorists, John Dlmpa. And John Dlmpa provides us with a pretty nuanced definition of power. And according to Dlmpa, there are actually three different faces or three different types of power. There's what he calls overt power, where you force someone to do something they otherwise would not do. That, he says, is the least dangerous type of power because both parties know what power is. They both know that power is being exercised. No one's being surprised. No one's being tricked. That's what he calls overt power. He says the second type of power is what he calls mobilization of bias, which is agenda setting. So if you have access to the agenda of the decision-making body, you can then keep issues off of the agenda, and that will then benefit you. So you keep issues off the agenda, and you will benefit by keeping those issues off the agenda. If they never get onto the agenda of a formal decision-making body, then no decision will be made about that issue. So when you liken it to an organization, every organization, whether figuratively or literally, has an agenda. You go to meetings and there's an agenda for your meeting. Well, who decides what's on that agenda? Well, if only one person decides what's on that agenda, the manager decides, then they have mobilization of bias power. They have agenda setting power. And if they don't put it on the agenda, then nothing's going to happen. I told you before, I served on a school board for about 6 years, and every meeting we had an agenda. That agenda, according to the Brown Act, had to be published publicly in advance, 72 hours before the meeting. We as a board were restricted to only talk about and make decisions about what was on that agenda for that meeting. If you try and make a decision about something that's not on the agenda, then you're in violation of the Brown Act, and then it goes to the Attorney General, and it's a huge issue. So you can only discuss what's on that agenda. Our agendas were established by the school superintendent and the president of the board. And I served as president of the school board, and so I would meet with the superintendent for sometimes upwards of 4 or 5 hours each week, putting together the agenda and deciding what issues would be on the agenda for that weekly meeting. That's a mobilization of bias type of power. Then the third type of power that Dlmpa talks about is what he refers to, and I kind of refer to as well, as what he calls co-optation. Co-optation is when you can convince someone that something is in their best interest when it really is not. And the example Dlmpa uses is with coal miners. And so he went into this very small town in rural Appalachia. That was a coal mine town. There was really one employer in the town, and that was the coal mine. And pretty much everyone worked for that coal mine. Anyone who worked was either a coal miner or they worked in the company store, which is owned by the coal mine company. And what had happened is the coal mine company was having the coal miners working 70, 80 hours weeks. And they're working these 78-hour weeks in very dangerous mine conditions. Mines have this nasty tendency to blow up if you don't go through a process known as dusting of the mine. When you dust the mine, you can tamp down some of the gases and make it less likely for the mine to explode if there's any open flame in the mine. Well, that costs money, and that takes time, and that reduces the profits of the coal mine company. So a lot of coal mine companies were not engaging in dusting, but they were convincing their employees, you should work 70, 80-hour weeks in this very dangerous mine, and we're going to pay you with tokens. We're not going to give you money at the end of the week. We're going to give you a token. Those tokens can then only be redeemed where? In the company store, this general store that was owned by the coal mine company. And they were able to convince coal miners that this was in your best interest, to do all these things that are so clearly opposite of their best interest. They were able to co-opt their opinion. So there are a lot of ways to look at power. Follett really believed that power was something that managers and leaders had the obligation to help develop on the part of their employees. And this is important because this kind of lays the seeds for the future school of thought known as human resource management theory that we'll talk about a little bit later on tonight. And the seeds for that really were laid by some of these theories from Mary Parker Follett a good 4 decades before human resource management theory really started up in earnest. But if you're going to develop resources on the part of your employees, it means you're going to have participation. You're going to have coordination and communication. So Follett also came up with her principles of organization. So she uses the word principles, but in a little bit different way as opposed to the principal school of Gulick and Phelan Mooney. When Follett talks about principles, she's really talking from a much more pro-employee type of perspective. Her principles are, number one, coordination. We need to coordinate between our departments and our individuals so that we can achieve that integration, so we can resolve these conflicts in everyone's interests. So we need to have that coordination. We need to have early contact, meaning that we need to communicate with our employees, and we need to do it from the moment they join the organization. So we need to have this early communication and contact with our employees. We need to take everyone's perspective into account. We need to value everyone's opinion. We can't shut down people's opinion. We can't get involved in what Janice refers to as groupthink. We need to accept and entertain all perspectives. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to achieve this interpenetration of ideas. We also have to recognize that this coordination between members of our organization, that coordination is dynamic in nature, that it will change over time. So how we do our coordination today may be different than how we do our coordination next month. We may have different people in the organization. We may have the relationships have changed between people in our organization. We may have different influences from our external environment. So we need to remember this coordination communication is dynamic. What Follett is able to do with her theories is she is able to start introducing us to more models of organizational effectiveness than what we were used to seeing with our classical theorists. If you look at page 145, I think Tompkins does a pretty good job, and I agree with him, in relating Follett's theories to the 4 different models of organizational effectiveness. And you'll see, according to Tompkins, her theories favor obviously human relations. And this is the first time we have seen the human relations model be emphasized by any of the theories we have talked about yet up to this point in time in this class. It's a human relations type of model because she's trying to build cohesion. She's trying to enhance the morale of employees within the organization. And we're really starting to, as I said before, to lay the seeds for human resource development for the first time in the organization theory literature. Clearly, her focus is primarily within the organization, so it's an internal process model as well. And she's still favoring the ultimate goal, which is achieving the goal of the organization. So it's still a macro level goal, even though she's willing to entertain micro level activities and strategies. She's still trying to achieve that ultimate macro level goal of achieving the goal of the organization and making the organization as effective as possible. But the first time we now see 3 of those models of organizational effectiveness come into play with Mary Parker Follett in her pre-human relations types of theories, her democratic organization type of an approach. How does she control and coordinate the activities of employees? She does it through mutual adjustment. And so again, here's the first time we're really getting into this mechanism known as mutual adjustment. In mutual adjustment, employees are allowed to collaborate with each other. They communicate with each other. They communicate with each other for the purpose of making decisions about their jobs, making decisions about goals and objectives. And they actually get to communicate with each other. Rather than being told what to do, they're allowed to collaborate on what to do and how to do it. So you can see how we're certainly moving more out of the classical school and more toward a human relations type of an approach. But in terms of her methods for motivation, we're moving out of legal compliance, like what we saw with our classical theorists, and we're moving more into approaches such as considerate leadership, where leaders talk to their employees, where they take their employees' wants, needs, and desires into account. She accepts the fact that there are groups in the organization. After all, she talked about particularized interests like Madison's faction. She understands there are groups in organizations, and she says we need to accept those groups. The groups will always form within organizations, and we don't try to tamp them down. We don't try to eliminate them. We accept them, and we try and manage them effectively, again, to try and achieve organizational goals. And a little bit of job identification. Now, not a whole lot there. We're going to get into job identification when we get into human resource management theorists, but she gets into some of job identification, allowing people to help self-determine in their jobs, to help them identify what types of skills they want to develop, and to allow them to do tasks on a daily basis that will help them develop those skills that hopefully will then allow them to develop as human resources down the road. Again, job identification is something that the classical theorists were not terribly concerned about. They certainly were not concerned about informal groups within the organization, and they did very little in terms of worrying about the wants, needs, and desires of their employees, very little considerate leadership. So you can see what Follett is doing with her democratic organization is she is starting to move us away from the classical approach, and she really serves as a very nice bridge between the classical school and the School of Human Relations, this more neoclassical type of approach to how we structure and manage our organizations. Now, again, she didn't get nearly enough credit for being that very important bridge. She was a couple of decades ahead of her time. And so I think in terms of the accolades she received, she really suffered from that. But again, that's what makes her one of my favorite theorists, is because she was one of the first people out there willing to take issue with classical theories. And without Mary Parker Follett, I think we would have had a harder time accepting a lot of the human relations theorists from people like Mayo and Roethlisberger, because they would have been brand new. At least with Follett, she is this nice bridge into the world of human relations. So as we start to transition from the classical school into the School of Human Relations, now we're starting to take individual employees into account a bit more. And we're also starting to recognize that our organizations are not just stringent structures like they were in Weber's ideal bureaucracy, but they're actually social types of environments. And that social environments and informal groups can coexist in a organization theory, or organization structure like what we see from Max Weber. So one of the main human relations theorists that really fueled this movement away from classic organization theory is our good friend Elton Mayo. And I'm sure you have run into Elton Mayo before. If not before you were in this program, I'm sure you ran into him in the 500 class. Elton Mayo based a lot of his theories on social interaction. And he believes some of the problems in our organizations were based upon social disorganization and human irrationality. And what does he mean by that? He says that there's a lot, that at the time he was writing, there was a lot of social disorganization. And a lot of that social disorganization came from psychological perspectives, something he referred to as human irrationality. And this is kind of how his argument went. And I think there might be some truth to it, but his argument is that as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we had all these new industrial jobs that were being created in what we now lovingly refer to as our Rust Belt cities. So cities like, Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit, and we had a lot of these new industrial jobs being created in those Rust Belt cities. Well, we didn't have enough people to work those jobs in the steel mills and the ore factories and all those new industrial jobs. So what happened is some folks in the South, a lot of people in the South, didn't have the economic opportunities that they needed. And so you had people, once they got to the age of 14 or 15 or 16, they really didn't have economic opportunity. They weren't in school, they had dropped out of school, but there wasn't the same farming opportunities that there used to be in the 1800s. So what they did is they moved north, and they moved north to all these Rust Belt cities to take these industrial jobs. As they moved out of the nuclear family, if you will, at 14 or 15 or 16, they're moving north into these industrial jobs at a very young age. I mean, they're still teenagers, and in some instances, very early teens. They go into these factory types of settings. When they go into these factory settings, because they left home at such an early age, they haven't resolved a lot of their psychological issues yet with their family. They haven't gone through a full maturation process. And he would argue that because of that, a lot of these new employees in these industrial organizations suffer from what he calls human irrationality, and that they have not gone through a maturation process yet. I say that there is some truth to that, because that does a pretty good job of explaining my father and how my father ended up in Cleveland, Ohio. He started in rural eastern Kentucky on a dairy farm. Dairy farm then had to close up. He was, I think, 15 or 16 years old and went to Cleveland in pursuit of a steel mill job. And I think all his brothers did the same thing. I think it's kind of a common migration pattern, especially in the 1940s and 1930s and 1940s. Overlay on top of this human irrationality, Mayo says, is the factory system itself. So a lot of these folks are going to these industrial organizations that are very factory oriented. They have very much this long link type of technology that we talked about before with Thompson. That long link technology, that kind of factory assembly line type of way in which we do business, doesn't allow them to mature either, because they're focusing on one specific job, one specific task every single day, day in and day out. They just do that one job, and they don't have the bigger picture of the organization as a whole and the goals of the organization and how one aspect of the organization benefits another aspect of the organization. So he says a lot of our organizations are disorganized and they're suffering from this human irrationality, as well as just the machinations, the mechanics of a factory system. So what we need to do is we need to embrace the more social aspect of organizations and realize that organizations can help these employees go through their maturation process. And if we completely divorce work from social interaction, we're going to be disorganized and we're not going to be as effective or as efficient as we would like to be. So Mayo, being a good social scientist, conducted a whole series of experiments, and you may have read about a lot of these before. The one that we really focus on in this class, because it has the most connection, if you will, to organization theory, are his illumination studies, what have come to be known as the Hawthorne experiments. And I think we had made a brief mention of the Hawthorne experiments in last week's class. But the Hawthorne experiments, Mayo and his colleagues went into the Hawthorne electrical plant. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to assess the impact of external stimuli on employee productivity. And one very simple stimulus that they wanted to start out trying to use was changing the lighting level. Obviously, if you turn the lights up and people can see better, they're probably going to become more productive. So his first hypothesis was if we increase the lighting level, people will then be more productive. He increased the lighting level, people became more productive, confirmed that first hypothesis. His second hypothesis was just the inverse. He said, well, then logically, if we turn the lights down, people will not be able to see as well, so they'll become less productive. So he turned the lights down, and what happened? People continued to become more productive and became even more productive than when the lights were turned up in the first hypothesis. So it wasn't the external stimulus of changing the lighting level. Rather, it was the social interaction that was increasing employee productivity. Oops. And it increased employee productivity for a couple of reasons. One reason why productivity increased is that employees were being talked to. The researchers were talking to employees. They were asking them their opinion. They were asking them how comfortable they were doing their job. They were actually caring about the employee. And that was one of the first times the employees had someone actually ask their opinion on anything. And so that social dynamic was increasing productivity levels. A second dynamic that was going on was a group dynamic. What Mayo realized is that when people work together in groups, they tended to be more productive. And they tended to be more productive not just because there was a greater collection of skill sets in a group as opposed to one individual, but there was informal pressure that was being placed upon members of the group by other members of the group. So if one member of the group was not pulling their weight, they were not being as productive as they could be, that made the entire group look bad. So the other members of the group would then motivate this employee to work harder so the group didn't look bad. And it really clued Mayo into this idea of the importance of informal groups within organizations. So organizations can only be effective when you have that social interaction and when you embrace that social interaction and when you recognize that the organization is indeed a social environment and you allow people to engage socially within the organization. Now you can see how far that then takes us away from the classical school. Because in classical school, we were just concerned about how the job was being done, the structure of the organization, teaching our managers principles. We weren't talking about informal groups. We weren't talking about social dynamics. We didn't view the organization as being a social organization. Here, Mayo is viewing it as a social type of organization. Mayo had a very prominent student by the name of Fritz Roethlisberger. Roethlisberger picked up on a lot of Mayo's theories and extended them and said, well, we can take these findings from the Hawthorne experiments. We can take these findings from Mayo and we can use them to create a new, what Roethlisberger referred to as discipline. We can create a new discipline of organizations. And this new discipline of organizations will focus, number one, on communication and communication problems within the organization. If we do not have a good system of communication, both vertically and horizontally in our organization, those communication problems are going to make it difficult to have those social interactions. And people's social needs will be stymied if you don't have a good communication system. Secondly, Roethlisberger said the new discipline of organization theory should also focus on cooperation and the ability on the part of the manager to get the cooperation of their employees. That in order to be effective as an organization, that effectiveness is predicated upon our employees cooperating. If our employees are not cooperating, they're not going to give us the contributions that we need in order to be effective as an organization. Well, now, here's another novel type of idea when you compare it to the classical school. In the classical school, you got employees to comply through legal compliance. You got them to comply by telling them what to do, and if they do it well, you give them some money. If they don't do it well, you show them the door. There wasn't a whole lot of cooperation that was going on. You either do what you're supposed to do or else you're gone. Here in the human relations school, we're looking at the importance of cooperation. We have to get the compliance and cooperation on the part of our employees. And the third aspect of this new discipline that Roethlisberger was promoting is a renewed focus or a new focus on maintaining individual and organizational equilibrium through change. What does that mean? Organizational harmony. This is really laying the antecedents for the organizational harmony school that developed a few decades later. We have to try and get harmony within our organization, harmony between individual employees and the needs of the organization. And we kind of try and find that balance, or what the systems theorists will refer to next week as homeostasis. We find this balance, we find this equilibrium between employees and the organization, and recognize that that equilibrium is subject to change over time. That equilibrium, once you find it, once you find that kind of nexus between what the individual wants and what the organization wants, that may change. You may have different employees coming in. You may have different leaders and managers coming in. You may have a new piece of legislation that changes the functions and the purpose of your organization. Maybe the program or policy that you're implementing gets done away with or gets vastly changed due to new legislation. All those things can change this equilibrium. So this equilibrium that we're trying to find in our organization is a very dynamic type of equilibrium. But in order to find that equilibrium, we have to talk to our employees, we have to communicate with them, and we have to get their cooperation to help us achieve our organizational goals. So Mayo and Roethlisberger, two human relations theorists that have now taken us even further away from the classical school of organization theory, talking about needing cooperation on the part of our employees, talking about the need to talk to our employees, to communicate with our employees in order to engender this organizational harmony, this balance, this equilibrium between organizational needs and individual needs. What really sets the human relation theorists apart from the classical theorists is this recognition of the organization as a social system. That we not only have a formal organizational structure, we not only have formal types of groups within our organization, but we also have informal groups and informal structures that will develop within the organization as well to satisfy the social interaction needs of our individual employees. And we need to recognize the organization is a social environment and treat it as a social environment if we want to be effective and efficient as an organization. Chester Barnard, and we're going to encounter Chester Barnard a couple of times in this class. We're going to encounter him now, and then we're going to encounter him again next week when we talk about systems theory, because he really contributes both to human relations school as well as a systems school. But Chester Barnard agrees with this need for cooperation. He agrees with Mayo and Roethlisberger that in order to be effective as leaders and managers, we cannot lead by dictating what people do. We instead lead by getting people's compliance. The only way to be effective as a leader, manager, or even as an organization overall is to get the compliance on the part of your members of the organization. So how do you do that? Barnard argues that there is a balance in organizations, and that balance is between incentives and contributions. So the organization needs contributions from its employees, and employees can contribute a great number of things to the organization and the organization's goals. So individual employees can contribute their time, they can contribute their expertise, they can contribute their effort, they can contribute their loyalty and fidelity to the organization. They can contribute by teaching new employees and training and mentoring new employees. There are a lot of contributions that they can give to the organization to help the organization achieve its goals. In order to get those contributions, leaders and managers must give them the right inducements, the right set of incentives to induce them to give those contributions. Well, in order to know what incentives to give to a certain employee to get the contributions that you need to get their compliance, you need to know that employee. You need to know the wants, needs, and desires of that employee, because the wants, needs, and desires of employees will differ between different employees. So you need to know your employees as individuals to know what set of inducements and incentives to provide to those employees. So it's all based upon communication and participation. But again, you're not, under Chester Barnard's theory, you're not doing it necessarily to benefit the employees. You're doing it to get the right set of contributions from those employees to benefit the organization. So when all is said and done, the goal is still an organizational goal, and employees are then the contributors to that organizational goal. They are more or less a means to an end with Chester Barnard. Barnard said that, yes, you need to provide the right set of incentives to get compliance and contributions. But he also recognized that if you ask the wrong thing of your employees, you're never going to get their compliance, you're never going to get their contributions. Barnard developed this theory known as the zone of indifference. And Barnard argues that every employee has their own unique zone of indifference. The zone of indifference speaks to someone's values, someone's ethical system, someone's ethical mores. That if you ask someone to take an action or provide a contribution that violates their ethical principles or violates their values, they're going to push back against you, and they're not going to give you those contributions. You're not going to get their compliance. But there is a zone of indifference for every employee where you can ask them to do something, and if it doesn't violate their principles, it doesn't violate their ethical standards or their values, they're more than likely going to go ahead and do it. That's what he refers to as their zone of indifference. So in order to get compliance as a leader or manager, you need to operate within each employee's unique zone of indifference. As long as you're in that zone of indifference, you're probably going to get their contributions, their compliance. Once you get outside of that zone of indifference and you have violated their value system, then you're never going to get their compliance or their contributions. Now, again, the important thing here with Barnard's idea of leading by compliance and his zones of indifference is that you need to know your individual employees. You need to talk to your individual employees, communicate openly with them so that you can know what their zones of indifference are, what types of incentives they value. So there's much more participation in Chester Barnard and human relations theory than what we ever hope to see in the classical school of organization theory. Now, we know that there's classical theory alive and well in our modern organizations. We talked about that in our breakout groups last week. You're going to talk about that this week in your discussion board posts. We know that classical, Weber and Taylor, they exist in our modern organizations. We also know that human relations theory also exists in our modern organizations as well, through things such as counseling programs. Now, most organizations will have counseling programs, most of them referred to as EAPs or employee assistance programs. EAPs are good examples of human relations theory, where people can take advantage of certain types of resources that are provided to them by the organization. They can get counseling through the EAP to, again, help them in this maturity process, to help them with issues that they're having in the organization or even in their private life. We also do a robust training and development program in most of our organizations. Again, training and development, much more akin to human relations theory than what we saw back in the days of classic organizations. Oops. So human relations theory, what does it look like in comparison to the models of organizational effectiveness, the mechanisms for coordination and control, and the methods for motivating our employees? Well, in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, Tompkins tells us clearly it's human relations. It's human relations theory, so it's kind of a no-brainer to know that it's human relations model as well. And I think that is certainly true. I do believe that there is an internal process component to it, so I would also highlight the internal process model. And since the ultimate goal of human relations theory is to achieve the goals of the organization and get the compliance on the part of our employees to achieve those goals, I would also argue that there's some rational goal model as well, because we're still focusing on that organizational goal. Getting the compliance on the part of our employees is just a step toward, it's a means toward the end of accomplishing the goals of the organization. How do we control and coordinate work activities? Well, it's kind of top down. There is some mutual adjustment, but there's still kind of a top down element here because you're getting the compliance on the part of your employees. You're not necessarily developing the resources like you did with Mary Parker Follett. You're not developing their power as you do with Mary Parker Follett. Here, instead, you're kind of using them as a tool in order to achieve the goals of the organization. So it's more direct supervision as opposed to mutual adjustment was under Follett. Methods for motivating our employees. Again, we see a lot of considerate leadership, talking to our employees, finding out what motivates them, finding out what set of incentives would be successful in getting compliance, finding out what their zones of indifference are. That's considerate leadership. And group acceptance, realizing that people are going to work in groups, and we know under Elton Mayo that it's a very social type of organization, and it's important that we recognize the social aspects of our organizations, again, in order to make our organizations effective and efficient. Now, that's the human relations school. Clearly, there are other schools that have developed, like human resource management and systems and organization culture and leadership, that have been developed after the human relations school. If there are no criticisms of the human relations school, we could stop right there and say, well, this is what we do, this is the accepted practice, we're in the human relations school. But we know that there are some major criticisms of human relations theory. And one of the primary criticisms is that it's exploitative in nature. That what leaders and managers do, especially under Barnard, is that they are getting the compliance on the part of their employees to achieve organizational goals. Not for the benefit of the employee, not to develop the employee as a resource, but rather to accomplish the goals of the organization. Since your ultimate goal is that macro level organizational goal type of perspective, a lot of critics will say it's overly exploitive and that it's exploiting the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees for organizational purposes. And because of that critique, it then led to the development of another school known as a School of Human Resource Management. Some people refer to it as modern human resources theory. Some call it human resource management theory. I tend to opt for human resource management theory, where we take human relations theory, the participation, the communication that was part of human relations theory, and we expand it to try and develop our employees as human resources. So we not only take into consideration the needs of our employees, but as an organization, we try to fulfill those needs under human resource management theory. And I think that's the big thing that sets it apart from human relations theory. So again, in human relations theory, we want to know what the needs of our employees are so we can then use those needs and leverage them to accomplish the goals of the organization. In human resource management theory, we want to know those needs so that we as an organization can help fulfill those needs to develop our employees as human resources. Again, to take a line from President Kennedy and kind of shift it up a little bit. In human resource management theory, it would be asking not just what you can do for the organization, not just asking what the employee can do for the organization, but what the organization can do for the employee. So it becomes important that we consider individual goals as well as organizational goals. So it's not just about the macro, but now it becomes about the micro approach as well. So one author we oftentimes talk about with the School of Human Resource Management theory is our good friend Abraham Maslow. And you have run into Abraham Maslow probably again and again throughout your academic career. If you are a psychology major, you certainly talked a whole lot about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And I will tell you, there is a classical approach to his hierarchy of needs, and that's what most people talk about, and that's what's represented here on the screen. But I think we also need to recognize that later on in life, at the very tail end of Maslow's career, he modified his hierarchy of needs, and he changed it up a little bit. And we'll talk about kind of the new and improved version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But in the more traditional approach, Maslow postulates to us that every individual has their own hierarchy of needs. And the hierarchy of needs, again, fits neatly into this little pyramidal shape. At the bottom of your hierarchy of needs, you have things like your physiological needs. And so needs such as food, needs such as water, needs such as shelter. Those are your basic physiological needs. As an individual, we are motivated by a deficiency in those physiological needs. So as long as we have a deficiency, we don't have enough food, water, shelter, we're going to be motivated to try and fill that deficiency. Once that deficiency is filled, then physiological needs will no longer serve as a motivator for us. We move to a second level of needs, which are safety needs. Safety needs are things such as, feeling of being secure, the feeling of safety. Again, we're motivated by a deficiency in our feelings of safety and security. But once we have remedied those deficiencies and we feel safe and secure, then those needs will cease to be a motivator as well. They can move on to another level of needs known as your belongingness and your love needs. The need to be in relationships with people and have friendships, that you belong to something bigger than just yourself. That's kind of a psychological type of need. And that as well is a deficiency need, because we are motivated by a deficiency in these psychological needs. But once we have remedied that deficiency, they will again no longer motivate us. Then your next level of needs are esteem needs. Again, more psychological needs. The need to feel prestige and feeling of accomplishment, feeling that people really respect you and people hold you in high esteem. You're going to be motivated by that until that's also been rectified. And once you have rectified that, and once you have eliminated those deficiencies, which most of us don't ever eliminate those deficiencies, but theoretically, if you ever eliminate those deficiencies, then they probably won't motivate you anymore. And then the top level at the apex is what he referred to as self-actualization. Self-actualization is achieving one's full and utmost potential. It's kind of like the U.S. Army used to tell us in their advertisements, be all you can be. But being all you can be is self-actualization. This type of self-fulfillment need is what Maslow referred to as a growth need. So the bottom four are deficiency needs. You're motivated by trying to remedy a deficiency. Self-actualization is a growth need, which means that you are perpetually motivated by self-actualization. This need never ends. You're always motivated by this need to grow and to achieve your utmost potential. And so this is the type of need that you're always striving to try and fulfill. As I said, later in life, though, Maslow revisited his traditional hierarchy of needs and changed it a little bit. And that top need of self-actualization, he changed that into a need to give back. And the top level need in his modern hierarchy of needs was the need to give back to society and to give to future generations, to contribute to the perpetuation of humankind, if you will. And so it was bigger than just ourselves. It was really trying to go beyond ourselves and try and benefit society as a whole. But still, that was very much of a growth need, in that it was a continuous need that would continue throughout our entire lives. But so what? My favorite question, so what? Well, the so what is that everyone has a different hierarchy of needs. Now, most people will kind of follow what's on the screen, but different people may have different hierarchies. In that, for some people, maybe esteem needs are not as important as the need for love and belonging. Maybe safety needs are more important than the need of love for love and belonging. And so you may have a different arrangement of these needs, which means that leaders and managers in our organizations need to know their employees to know what their employees need, and if they need to fill a deficiency or if they need to grow, because those will lead to different types of behaviors and motivations on the part of our employees. So it kind of tells us people are unique, and we need to treat them as unique individuals within our organizations. Douglas McGregor believed in Abraham Maslow. He liked Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he took that as a jumping off point for the development of his own theory. And his theories really became encapsulated in his book, The Human Side of the Enterprise, where Douglas McGregor really started to evaluate and study organizations by studying people within those organizations. And so it is kind of, in our first class session, we talked about the micro and the macro and the behavioral type of approach to studying organizations. And we talked about the political science literature and how it kind of went from the traditional approach of studying institutions to the approach of studying individuals to the approach of studying the interaction between individuals and organizations. Douglas McGregor was interested in studying individuals and how they interact with organizations. So that more modern type of approach to how we study our institutions. What McGregor is best known for, and again, you probably run into him before in 500, is his Theory X and Theory Y approach. So in the Theory X approach believes that individuals are lazy, they're not terribly creative, they're unmotivated, they're not terribly intelligent, they're going to kind of engage in what Taylor told us was soldiering, they're going to loaf off, they're not really going to work very hard. It's a very negative view of individual human beings. That's what he called Theory X. Theory Y is obviously just the opposite of that. In Theory Y, you have people who are motivated, they're intelligent, they are creative, they're going to seek out responsibility, they're going to aspire to those superordinate types of positions, a much more glowing, if you will, view of individual human beings. What McGregor tells us is that the majority of our employees are Theory Y employees. The majority are intelligent, they are creative, they do seek out authority and responsibility. Not everybody. And he was a realist, so he realized we have a few clunkers, but for the most part, The vast majority of our employees are Theory Y employees. The problem, though, is they are shoehorned into Theory X organizations. When you take a Theory Y employee and you shoehorn them into a Theory X organization, that Theory X organization is going to not motivate them. It's going to make them very dissatisfied. It's probably going to make them want to leave the organization. And what McGregor said is we need to take our Theory X organizations and transform them to make them better match our Theory Y employees. So the big question then is, well, how do we go about that? How do we take a Theory X organization and transform it into a Theory Y organization that can better meet the needs of our individual employees? Well, he argues that one of the main ways we can do it is through self-governance and self-determination. Allowing people to self-determine what they do on a daily basis and contribute to their role, defining their role within the organization, so that we can provide them with opportunities to develop as human resources. So if you have a Theory Y employee who is aspiring to a superordinate position, that superordinate position may require a certain type of skill set that their current job doesn't allow them to develop. You find out what positions they want to aspire to, what types of skills they want to develop, and then you can refashion their position to allow them to develop those skills so that they can then move to those superordinate positions. We're helping them develop as human resources. So the important thing here is with a Theory Y organization, the goals of the employee become important just like the goals of the organization. So it's not all just a macro approach. Now it's a combination of the micro approach on individual goals combined with the macro approach of organizational goals. And ostensibly, if you can meet those individual goals, that can then help you meet your organizational goals. It is okay if you provide the training and you provide the support for individuals to develop their resources and their abilities, and they then eventually take those resources and abilities and move to other organizations. That's okay because you have achieved your goal of helping that person develop as a human resource. So you can see just how different McGregor and human resource management theory is from Weber, Taylor, and our classical theorists. But as oftentimes happens, these theorists then have students who take their theories, pick up and run with them. And one of Douglas McGregor's students was Chris Argyris. And Chris Argyris took McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y and developed his own personality theories from them. And his personality theories really revolve around this idea of the need for personal growth, that every individual has this inherent need for personal growth. And it's incumbent upon the organization to find ways to help foster that individual's personal growth. According to Argyris, as people mature, they go through this personal growth process whereby they become increasingly active. They become active in their communities, in their organizations, in their professions. So we have this movement toward increasing activism as part of the maturation process. Also, as part of the maturation process, people increase their independence as individuals. They're no longer as dependent upon parents or family members, and they become independent actors, controlling their own destiny. As people go through the maturation process, they generate the ability to behave in a multiplicity of ways. They can behave in lots of different ways in the organization. They develop deepening interests, that they're not just superficial interests about, well, how much can I make next year compared to this year? Their interests deepen, and their interests become more about what they can give back to society and to future generations, kind of like that new self-actualization according to Maslow. As they go through maturation, they take on a longer time perspective. So they're not just concerned about what's happening this afternoon or tomorrow. They're interested about 5 years and 10 years and 20 years from now. they begin to aspire more to these superordinate positions. They want authority, they want responsibility that comes with those superordinate types of positions. They develop a keener sense of self awareness where they know themselves better as individuals, as human beings. This personal growth arc is something that the majority of people go through. But Theory X organizations inhibit that type of personal growth. They don't give you the ability to increase your activism. They don't give you the ability to act independently or to behave in multiplicity of ways. They don't recognize your deepening interests. They don't give you the opportunity to develop your resources so that you can aspire to those superordinate positions. They don't allow you to develop self-awareness. So it's kind of going back to McGregor and the whole idea of we need to take our Theory X organizations, make them Theory Y by recognizing what can the organization do to help the individual go through this personal growth type of maturation process. And one of the best ways in which to do it is to allow them self-governance and self-determination in terms of their roles within that Theory Y type of organization. We see Chris Ardress and Douglas McGregor in our modern organizations through a lot of the ways in which we've changed job analysis and job evaluation processes. As you know, in your organization, if you've done any work in HR, or even if you have a position description, you know that we have a classification system in our public organizations. And we go through and we do a job analysis of each individual position within our organization to determine what's going on and what that employee incumbent does on a daily basis in each one of these jobs. We then take the results of the job analyses and we then use them to do a job evaluation. We compare one position to another for the purpose of then compensation and classification. So we do a lot of these reclassification types of studies where we reclassify our positions, hopefully for the incumbent, moving the position to a higher grade in the position classification system. Well, as we do that, we need to involve the employee. And we need to ask the employee just not what are they doing on a daily basis, what types of skills do they want to develop, and what types of activities do they want to engage in, and let them have some self-determination and some self-governance. Another example of incorporating it in our organizations is through the performance evaluation process. In the past, performance evaluations were basically something that was done to an employee. Now our performance evaluations are done with the employee. So we will include the employee in developing the performance evaluation form and let the employee participate in putting together their performance expectations and gain agreement between the supervisor and the employee on what the real performance expectations are and what types of training and development needs are then necessary to help them achieve these performance expectation levels. Sometimes it means cross-functional training, where you allow them to train in other positions. Sometimes it means that you're going to have to provide them with new training opportunities so they can develop this new skill set that will help them in their new position description. But again, it's looking at this relationship between the organization and the employee. And it's no longer what the employee can do for the organization, but now it's also what can the organization do for the employee. And that, in a nutshell, is the big difference between human resource management school and human relations school. Human relations school, what can the individual do for the organization? Now, also, what can the organization do for the individual? And there are other human resource management theorists as well, but Mayo and Ardress are two of the main ones that we cover because I think they really kind of do a nice job of creating a microcosm of what human resource management is really all about. So human resource management theory, in comparison to the models of organizational effectiveness, is going to look a lot like Mary Parker Follett. So even though she was a pre-human relations theorist, a lot of her theories are more similar to human resource management theory than they were to human relations theory. So we certainly have an emphasis on the human relations model where we're trying to build cohesion, we're trying to build morale among our employees so that our employees then feel more connected to the organization. We're certainly looking within the organization. We're talking about how we deal with our employees, our human resources. So there is that internal process focus. And I do believe there is a rational goal type of focus, but there's a multiplicity of goals. It's not just the goal of the organization, but now it's also the goal for those individual employees. Like Mary Parker Follett, the primary mechanism for coordination is going to be mutual adjustment. We are going to allow our employees to participate in self-governance and self-determination of what they do and how they do it on a daily basis, so they can identify the types of skills that they want to develop as human resources. Our methods for motivation, Mary Parker Follett, we've got job identification. We have goal congruence now. So in job identification, what we're doing is we are trying to create jobs with employee input that our employees can really connect with, that they really feel they can identify with, that really reflects the types of skills that they want to develop as individuals. And then we also have goal congruence to a bit of a lesser degree, but also goal congruence in that it's not just the goal of the organization, it's the goal of the individual. And we're looking for that nexus between the goals of the organization and the goal of the individual. It's not just about the macro, now it's about the micro level approach as well. So as we go across those three, basically, if you want to call them schools, those three schools, if you will, pre-human relations theory, which is Mary Parker Follett, human relations theory, Mayo, Roethlisberger, and Barnard, and then human resource management theory with people like Maslow and McGregor and Ardress. I think what you have seen is you've seen us move slowly but surely away from the classical school, where we start to take into consideration our individual employees, and we take them into consideration not just for what they can get to the organization, but we also talk about the inverse of what the organization can give back to our employees. So you want to know the wants, needs, and desires of your employees for the purpose of wanting to know what those wants, needs, and desires are, for the purpose of helping your employees develop, rather than just helping the organization achieve its goals. Again, I think you can kind of see why we cover these theories and these schools of thought in a chronological fashion, because it really does give us a good view of the development of the organization theory literature. So I think we've already talked a lot about what really kind of differentiates these theories from each other. Human relations theory is more of a top-down type of approach. Human resource management theory is more bottom-up, in that it's more employee-focused for the right reasons, as opposed to human relations theory that is more of a top-down focus, seeing what we could get and how we can get those contributions out of our employees. What really ties those theories together, though, number one, as we said before, more of a focus on our employees beyond just the organization itself. But another thing that really ties those theories together is their focus internally, that HR, HRM, both focus internal to our organization. We have not really gone beyond the walls of our organization yet. We won't go beyond the walls of our organization until we talk next week about systems theory. And next week, when we get into systems theory, that's when we'll start talking about the relationship between the organization and its external environment, how it affects its external environment, and then how the external environment then affects the organization. So at this point, are there any questions on human relations theory, human resource management theory? Okay. If not, then it's about time to apply them. So, but before we get to that point, let's go ahead and take a break for the evening. We will call it 7:24. We'll call it 7:25. Let's take a break until 7:40. Give us about a 15-minute break. We come back at 7:40. I then have breakout room assignment like we always do every week for you. We'll talk about that. I'll break you up into groups, and then we'll spend about half an hour working on that, reconvene, see what you came up with, and then we will call it a Monday evening. So take a break till 7:40. Come on back, and we'll do our breakout rooms. Okay, it's 7:40, so we are back. As always, in the second half of class, we'll do our breakout rooms. And so the exercise for tonight is obviously to use some of the information we covered in the first half of class. So each breakout room should explore the aspects of Follett and Mayo that you see within your organizations. Please identify at least one aspect of Follett's theory and one aspect of Mayo's theory evident in your organizations. Each room, as always, should select a colleague to be a spokesperson and share out the room's findings with the rest of the class. So that's what we will be doing. It is 7:41, so we'll devote about half an hour to this. And so we'll say to about around 8:10 or 8:15, and then we'll reconvene and see what you came up with. So again, one aspect of Follett and one aspect of Mayo in your organizations. Sound good? All righty, let me go ahead and open up the rooms, and then we can all have at it. And the rooms are now open. Okay, I think
Bye-bye.
I think everything's all closed up now, so we should all be coming back in. Let's see if everyone's back. Yep, looks like we're all back in and ready to roll. Okay, good deal. Oops, hold on. Okay. All right, let's go with room number 1. Again, just one aspect of Follett and one aspect of Mayo.
Hi everyone, my name is Karina. So for our group 1, I think all of us could identify with our organizations. We're open to our ideas and input, and they really want to develop us and support us on moving on up in our careers and development within the organization. And then for Mayo, some of us identified with exploitation. So our skills are kind of used for the advancement of the organization. And there's some benefit to us where we learn a lot, but it's not always compensated. So for some people, they're unpaid, they're working on weekends additionally, but it's not necessarily paid. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Karina. And yeah, and one thing we didn't talk a lot about, which you probably should have when we talk about Mary Parker Falls, I think your group is kind of hitting that a little bit, is that Follett sounds great, and we all want to be considered, and we all want to have our ideas taken into consideration, but we didn't really talk a lot about the pragmatism or lack thereof with Follett. And we know that our organizations, even though we do have some elements of human relations and human resource management theory in our organizations, we also know that organizations need to accomplish their goals. And so sometimes Follett can be a little bit idealistic in terms of having the time and the incentive to really have this type of open communication all the time with employees. And we do know that when organizations are faced with crisis situations, they have to act very quickly. And there's a theory out there in the leadership literature that looks at the experience versus the intellect of leaders. And in high stress, high crisis types of situations, it's really the experience of the leader that shines through more so than the intelligence. And leaders have to act very quickly and react to situations quickly based on their experience. They oftentimes don't have the time or the resources to involve all employees in the process. And so sometimes I do think Follett can be a little bit idealistic. And I think that even when you do have these HR elements, there is some feeling of exploitation in our organizations among some of our employees. So I think that's a really good point. Okay, thank you for agreeing. Thank you very much. Okay, room number 2. Who's our spokesperson?
Sorry, is that our group?
That is, let's see, yeah, Daisy, Jacqueline. Let's say, yes, Daisy, that's your group.
Yes. Okay, so I think for all of us, what was most common is under Follett's is the coordination between departments and individuals, as far as one example is having cross-training between departments, so that if one person is out, or if someone else needs to step in to help another department, that person can help out. Or for example, if one person's not comfortable stepping into a different department, they, I think it was Cello's organization, offered the buddy system. So they can work with another employee to carry out tasks. And then under Mayo's, when it came down to employee morale, like we discussed about how relaxed supervision kind of helps productivity, because if you feel like you're being watched continuously watched, I mean, there is some positive and negative to that, where I guess if you're relaxed supervision, you're more productive because you're not worried or about how you're producing. And then I guess as far as a positive thing about that is if you're rated about, in customer service, you always want to have a pleasant demeanor. So it kind of goes both ways, but as far as employee morale, that was one of the things we discussed.
Very good. Thank you, Daisy. And
Thank you.
yeah, I think those are both good elements. I think that the cross-functional training, that's really good to hear that organizations are doing that, because we see that very frequently in the private sector. I know Honda is a great example. Honda does a lot of cross-functional training in their organization, and we oftentimes see it more in the private as opposed to the public sector. So it's good to hear that that's going on in those organizations. Very good. Thank you, Daisy. And let's see, room number 3.
Hello, good night, everyone. And for our group, in terms of Mayo, we discussed the social interactions part. There was one of our peers who their organization gives them an hour and a half per month for them to go out to lunch as a team and kind of just interact and get to know each other. I know at my organization, we have a Slack channel where we talk about work things, but sometimes also include articles we find interesting, just things that we come up in the day. Jokes, just things to kind of interact and get to know each other a little bit more. And then in terms of Follett, we did see that there's the respond to situations based on needs. So if there's a need to get together and try to work out a situation, they have all staff meetings where they try to figure out how to solve things together and have everyone say something or give their opinion or how they see the situation. And it's not that every problem gets an all-staff meeting, but when it is needed, that is an option.
Great. Thank you, Monica. Yeah, I think having those all-staff meetings, it certainly does contribute to to Mayo and that type of social environment. Having that Slack channel in which you can have that type of communication, I think emphasizes both Follett as well as Mayo, and so those are great examples. Well done. Thank you. Yeah, let's see, group 4. Oh my goodness, I think we're only down to Crystal and Sam in group 4.
So yeah, this is Kieran. I'll talk about group 4. So group 4 has, I work for Orange County Sanitation District. Crystal works for City of Torrance. Sam works for Department of Food and Agriculture, and Louis used to work for Mayor's office in LA, and now he works for City of Malibu. So all of us work for public organizations. And in terms of my workplace, which is Orange County Sanitation District in Fountain Valley, we talked about Follett in terms of promoting collaborative work. And then really, we just talked about that it's not because I guess we talk more about the negatives of the organization and the positives, that the collaborative work isn't promoted because they want us to collaboratively work together. It's more because it's needed for the performance of the plant and the plant to run. And in terms of Mayo's theory, I thought it was the group dynamics, the team relations, because we couldn't give the job performance, we can't give the output if the group dynamics aren't there. And the other team members were very similar. For example, Sam for Department of Agriculture, Food and Agriculture talked about Follett in terms of the power within with approach. And then social disorganization was another thing that we talked about in terms of co-worker dynamics, with the older ways of thinking versus newer ways of thinking. Then team relations, group dynamics, again for Mayo. Crystal talked about from City of Torrance's viewpoint, theory of democracy, that there is this hive type of effort that exists. And again, Louis and Crystal kind of similarly talked about old school versus new school and the human rationality and the ideas of social disorganization in terms of how the older ways of thinking versus our generation now is working for public agency. But really what we got together to talking about was more core of Mayo's human relation theory. That's what we kind of focused a lot on our discussion on, because we were talking about that, the idea that Mayo is talking about the human relations theory and saying humans are, complex and the different factors influence their behavior. That's true. That's great. That looks great on paper. We all know that. But I don't think that we discussed that we don't think our organizations really care about that we're complex. We have these different factors that influence our behavior. Even for group dynamics, which we all kind of related to, that the team relations was very important for all of the people to coordinate together. We said that it's not because the agency wanted us to work together or like have this, it's because it's essential for the job performance and output that's needed. Then the other aspect for Mayo that we discussed was, managers that should understand that employees have these unique needs and there isn't this one size fit all approach, and the communication is essential. That's typically what's lacking in public organizations, the managers and employees. There is this old school versus new school of thinking, because people that are there 20 years before you, they're really up the ladder, and the promotional efforts are happening because somebody was hired 2 years before you or 4 years before you. So the private sector manager employee relationship versus the public sector manager employee relationship is very different. The people aren't solely motivated by compensation was another aspect we discussed, that we're all in the public service world because we like what we are doing. We like the public service aspect. We're not driven just by money, but we did talk about the fact that a lot of the older generation that's there and is about to retire, they have no caps on their pension plans. We have caps on our pension plans. They can literally retire today and make the same amount of money that they are making on their job. So they're really coming to work for, just because they don't want to be home or they don't have hobbies. And then employees are more open to change when given an opportunity to participate. That's true, but I think it's really, for our organizations, it's more on the surface. We're all driven by mission and, purpose of the public agencies, that, you're protecting the public health, you're trying to do this for the city, or you're trying to do this for the organization that you're serving. So we were talking more about the negatives, that all of the Mayo's human relationship theory, that it sounds great on paper, but we can pick and choose what we want, but it's mostly driven by organization from their mission and objectives and not focused on the employee development. So it was hard for us to kind of just say that it's all like sugar coated, it's all nice, and this is like they're doing this for us or they're doing this for us. So this is what we all thought was common for at least the city of Torrance, the city of Malibu, and Department of Food and Agriculture and Orange County Sanitation District.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. And those are really important points. I think that what you have described, what your group has described, you do the collaboration, you do try and build healthy team relationships, but the ultimate goal is productivity and performance of the organization. I think that's a great way to underscore what human relations theory was about. And human relations theory, again, focused on the organizational goal. And I think that you really underscore that really well with your group's comments. I'd written down something else too here. Oh, the other thing, based upon your comments, I think we also need to acknowledge is that these theories, and as your comments underscore, are very much normative types of theories. And so, this is, Mayo saying we should do this as an organization. Paul is saying we should do this as an organization. What your group has said, and the other groups have said really eloquently as well, is that that's not necessarily the way it always works in the organization. There's the normative and the descriptive. The theories are the normative. What actually goes on in the organization, that's the descriptive. And sometimes never the two shall meet. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make. And just recognize these theories are very normative. They focus on what should or ought to happen, as opposed to what actually does happen on a daily basis. And again, that's what's I think so useful about doing this kind of half and half approach to our class sessions, so that you can take these normative theories and then see how they actually apply in your organization. Do these things as a group with your colleagues, and then in a future week, you'll be doing a similar type of thing solo on your beach board essay. And so it kind of gives you a couple of opportunities to kind of find that nexus between the classroom theory, the normative, and what actually goes on practically within public organizations. So some very, very good points. So thank you, Karen. And thank you to all our groups. I think that worked out very well. I think you were able to identify those aspects from Fall and Mayo. And again, I think we've got kind of see that human relations theory. where even though we say it's really good, we have this communication, this collaboration, but oftentimes we're doing it for a purpose. And that purpose is for organizational goals. But all of this is occurring within the walls of the organization. Next Monday, we're going to get into systems theory, and we're going to go beyond the organization's walls. We're going to start talking about the external environment and how the organization is just part of a bigger system, and how what the organization does is certainly guided by the external environment. And oftentimes, some of the characteristics of the external environment will also be directly influenced by the operations and the behaviors within our organization. So we'll get a little bit more complex next week and move outside the walls of the organization. So, okay, very well done. It's about 8:30, so I think that we have accomplished our goals for the evening. As always, I will have the recording up sometime tomorrow morning. It takes a while to get all that done, but it should be up by tomorrow morning. If you have any questions at all about any of the material, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to respond. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your beach board essays for this week and then talking to you again next Monday for discussion of systems theory. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week and have a great evening. See you later.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.